Learning about the bodies that came back after Hurricane Katrina has actually made me lose sleep. And I don't just mean the bodies that would have obviously been floating around after floodwaters took them away. No. There was this phenomenon that kept occurring as rescuers worked to recover victims that were killed when the levees broke or soon thereafter. Because the flooding was so bad, a lot of people had no choice but to start living on their roofs or out of their attics. Now, when floodwaters would rise suddenly, the poor people living in their attics would often get trapped, ultimately drowning in their own homes. So when rescue workers went out to search for survivors, they had a system of operations. Knowing that most people couldn't stay on the ground level of their homes because the waters had risen so much, but not knowing if it was safe to enter the home because the rescue teams themselves were worried they would get trapped, they came up with this knocking system where they would approach a home, knock on the doors and the walls, and call out to anybody that might be inside. After knocking, they would wait a few minutes and listen for someone to respond. Even if all they heard back was a faint tapping, potentially coming from the attic, they would do what they could to force entry into the home. But remember, a lot of these rescue teams are actually just civilians with boats, so they weren't always equipped to do so. Well, when they made entry into these homes where they heard knocking, they would often find people floating in the water. Sometimes there was still a person alive inside of the home knocking back that had been forced to try and survive in the home as their deceased loved ones floated around them. Other times, rescuers would enter the home after thinking they heard movement, only to find that whoever was inside was already gone. And this was reported quite frequently. When they did find a body, they would usually recover it and bring it to higher ground to await the help of mortuary teams. The rescue teams would then go around and mark the homes that were already cleared with an X on the door. But when a second team would come back through, they would continue to find bodies in the houses that already had X's on them. This kept occurring, where they would remove a body from a flooded home only to find that it had returned days later, floating eerily in the same spot it was recovered from before. When the floodwaters had shifted, the currents kept carrying the bodies that had been placed on higher ground back into the same street and sometimes into the same homes they had already been taken out of. Journalists and first responders in the lower Ninth Ward specifically reported on the bodies that continued to reappear in the same areas after they had already been logged and supposedly removed. A Coast Guard officer also described marking a home where a man had been found deceased on the front porch, only to find his body right back on the porch a few days later. Even the local morgue had staff members confirm that multiple notifications from the same addresses were coming in because the bodies just kept going back to their homes.